This morning's speeches highlighted those sacrifices of the troops who took part in the invasion. We've heard many personal stories from the veterans who are here today. Mark Phillips has covered several of these D-Day ceremonies. Mark, what makes this anniversary so special?
Well, the very fact that this is the 75th, and so if you were a young soldier around the age of 20, as most of them were, coming ashore on that day 75 years ago, you're well into your 90s now, some of them into their late 90s, and this could well be the last time this kind of living history can return here to have the experience and provide the lessons that an event like this provides.
It's interesting because it may be the last time, and surprisingly for some of these veterans, it's actually the first time they've been here since the invasion. It's very emotional for them, isn't it?
It is. I mean, some have come back several times. Some you do hear for the first time, getting on in years, wanting their children and particularly their grandchildren to know not just their personal story, but the significance of what took place here, and not just the sacrifice and the heroism, but also the history as well.
Yeah. During the ceremony, we saw one veteran stand up out of, I think, a wheelchair to hug President Trump.
Yeah.
You know, how important is this event to veterans, do you think?
Well, on the evidence of that, pretty important. His name was Private First Class Russell Pickett. He landed at Omaha Beach. He was wounded 3 times. Once in the first wave, was sent back to hospital, came back 6 days later, was wounded again, was wounded a 3rd time later in the battle in France, and is the last survivor, it seems, of Company A that landed on the beaches here that day.
There were a number of veterans who were singled out today, both by President Macron and by President Trump. In talking to these veterans in the last few days, what strikes you most about them?
I think the fact that they've long ago come to terms with what happened here, and now they're dealing with kind of the significance in their lives. You hear, a lot of them went back home, started their families, had their jobs, started businesses, and what happened. But it's now occurring to them, as it would late in your, as you're approaching 100 years old, that this was probably a seminal moment in their lives.
Yeah, and I was talking to Jake Larson, who we'll hear from later in this show, and he said the thing that keeps coming back to me is how lucky I was to leave here. Yeah. Seeing so many of his colleagues who are buried here behind us, and I think that's a sentiment a lot of these guys
You
have.
hear luck, and you hear, you guys were heroes, and to a man, they will tell you, no, we're not the heroes.
Yeah.
People in these graves.
These people behind us are. Gayle, it is a sentiment that is shared just about universally by the veterans here.
I keep hearing, Anthony, true heroes never say, I'm a hero. This is what strikes me about all of this is what strikes me really about all of these men. You talk about how emotional it is for the men. It's emotional for everybody who's just watching on television to hear their stories and to see what you have to say to them. To a T, what do you find that they have in common? Is it their grit? Is it their courage? Is it their candor? What is it?
You want to take that one?
Thanks.
No, I think
all those things, Gayle.
I think it's all those things, Gayle. But it's also what Mark said. It's none of them. Everybody says we had a job to do. It's almost the first answer you get from every one of these veterans you talk to, no matter how heroic they were on the day. None of them want to take credit, and they want to give that credit to the people they knew they left behind. And they're all very conscious of that they were lucky enough to lead their lives and have families.
I think pride is the word that you often hear coming up, and not just pride in what they did, but pride in what their unit did. The band of brothers phrase so often coined.
I mentioned Jake Larson, this vet I spoke to yesterday, who we'll hear from later, but he stood on the beach yesterday with me and he said, why am I here? Why was I the one who got to leave this beach? And that's a question a lot of these men still ask at this point, Gayle.
Yeah, one of the notes we keep hearing recurring when you hear from the veterans is they're not the heroes. These survivors, those being honored today, it's the men who are underneath those crosses that we're showing right now. I'm curious, have the veterans had the opportunity to make a visit to the cemetery that we're seeing behind you?
They've made visits here. They've also, it's difficult for some of them to get around. In fact, it's probably difficult for most of them to get around. But there are points you can get down to the beach where it's a little easier than, for example, here at the cemetery where it's almost impossible because the bluffs are so high. But you know, as I said, for a number of them, it's actually the first trip after 75 years, and so it's an incredibly moving experience for them. That a lot of them have brought their families, sons, wives, and so forth. So and they know it's really their last chance. Mark, thank you very much.